You don't let a bleeding man freeze to death on your porch. That's the rule. Even if his suit costs more than your car. Even if he's clutching a ruined gun. Nora dragged him inside because she was human, not because she was brave. She expected him to die on her cheap linoleum. She expected the cops. What she didn't expect was waking up the next morning to a literal army of 500 black SUVs idling outside her crumbling apartment building. The weather report had called it a once-in-a-generation freeze. For Nora, it was just Tuesday, and she still had to walk the 6 blocks from the diner to her apartment. The wind off the river didn't howl, it bit. It carried tiny shards of ice that felt like crushed glass against her exposed cheeks. She kept her head down, burying her chin into a scarf that smelled faintly of stale fry grease and cheap detergent. The streetlights flickered, fighting a losing battle against the rolling blackouts hitting the grid. When Nora finally turned onto Elm Street, the neighborhood was a graveyard of parked cars buried under snowdrifts. Her building was at the end of the block, a brick walk-up that had been slowly crumbling since the late 90s. She saw the smear of red first. It was jarring against the pristine, blinding white of the snow accumulating on her front steps. Nora stopped. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. She followed the trail of red up the 3 concrete steps to her small porch. A man was crumpled against her front door. He was a shadow tangled in an expensive wool overcoat, blending into the dark alcove. Nora didn't scream. Living in this part of the city burned the panic out of you by the time you were 20. Her first instinct was to step back, turn around, and find a diner that was still open. Let the morning shift deal with the body. But then the shadow exhaled. A ragged, wet sound. Nora swore softly. She stepped closer, her worn combat boots crunching in the snow. "Hey," she said, keeping her distance. "You can't sleep here." No response. She nudged his heavy leather shoe with her boot. Nothing. She crouched down, the cold immediately seeping through the knees of her jeans. Up close, the smell hit her. It cut right through the freezing air. Copper. Raw meat. Blood. A lot of it. She reached out, grabbing his shoulder to roll him over. He was impossibly heavy, dead weight settling into the ice. When she finally got him on his back, the ambient light from the street lamp caught his face. He was young, maybe early 30s. Sharp jaw, dark hair matted with sweat and melting snow. His skin was the color of old parchment, but it wasn't his face that made Nora's stomach drop. It was the coat. The wool was torn on the left side, soaked through with a spreading, near-black stain. And falling from his limp hand, hitting the snowy porch with a dull thud, was a matte black handgun. Nora stared at the gun. Then she looked at his face. A rational person would call the police. Nora reached into her pocket for her phone. The screen was black. The battery had died an hour ago in the cold. She looked down the street. Empty. The snow was falling harder now, erasing his footprints, erasing the blood trail. In 20 minutes, the temperature would drop another 10 degrees. He wouldn't make it to midnight. She looked at the gun again. She looked at the blood. "Damn it," she muttered. She grabbed him by the lapels of his coat. It took 3 tries to get him off the ground. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony. But he didn't wake. Nora wedged her shoulder under his armpit, wrapping her arm around his waist. He was solid muscle and dense, wet wool. Her knees buckled under the sudden weight, but she locked them, grinding her teeth. She fumbled with her keys with her free hand, dropping them twice before finally jamming the brass into the lock. She kicked the door open. Getting him inside was a clumsy, brutal ordeal. She essentially dragged him across the threshold, his boots scraping against the cheap wood laminate of her entryway. She kicked the door shut behind them, throwing the deadbolt out of sheer habit. The apartment was barely warmer than the outside, the radiators clanking uselessly. Nora didn't stop. She dragged him into the center of her small living room, finally letting her knees give out. She dropped him onto the faded rug, collapsing beside him, chest heaving. For a long minute, the only sound in the room was their synchronized, ragged breathing. Nora pushed herself up. She didn't have a phone. She didn't have a car. She had a half-empty first aid kit in the bathroom, a bottle of cheap whiskey in the kitchen, and a bleeding stranger on her floor. She stripped off her coat and threw it over a chair. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap, and let the water run until it was freezing cold. She splashed her face, gripping the edges of the sink. "Okay," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "Just stop the bleeding. That's it." Nora returned to the living room with a pair of trauma shears she'd kept from a brief, failed stint in nursing school, a stack of clean dish towels, and the whiskey. The man hadn't moved. His breathing was shallower now. She knelt beside him. Up close in the dim light of her floor lamp, the reality of the situation was stark. The fabric of his shirt was fused to his skin by dried and freezing blood. Nora didn't hesitate. She took the shears and cut through the ruined Italian wool of his coat, peeling it back. Then she cut through the silk shirt beneath it. The wound was on his left flank. A deep, jagged groove. It wasn't a clean puncture. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through muscle and fat, but it hadn't lodged inside. That was the only piece of good news. The bad news was that it was bleeding sluggishly but persistently, welling up dark and thick. She poured a liberal amount of whiskey directly onto a dish towel. "This is going to suck for you," she said aloud, mostly to break the suffocating silence of the room. She pressed the soaked towel directly into the wound. The man's eyes flew open. He didn't scream. His reaction was terrifyingly silent. His left hand shot out like a viper, his fingers locking around Nora's throat. His grip was weak, shaking with blood loss. But the intent was pure, trained violence. Nora froze. She didn't drop the towel. She didn't pull away. She looked down into his eyes. They were a pale, striking grey, currently blown wide with shock and pain. "You're bleeding on my rug," Nora said. Her voice was terrifyingly steady. "If you choke me, I let go of the pressure. If I let go of the pressure, you bleed out in about 10 minutes. Let go." The man stared at her. His chest heaved. He was assessing the room, her face, the pressure on his side. Slowly, the murderous fog in his grey eyes cleared, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. His fingers uncurled from her throat. His hand dropped heavily to the floor. "Who?" he rasped. His voice sounded like it was being dragged over gravel. "Nora," she said, keeping her weight pressed onto the towel. "You were dying on my porch. I brought you in." He closed his eyes, his head rolling back onto the rug. "Mistake?" "Probably," Nora agreed. "But I have a thing about dead bodies ruining my morning commute. Hold this." She grabbed his right hand and forced it over the towel, making him apply his own pressure. She stood up, went to the bathroom, and came back with a roll of medical tape, gauze, and a bottle of iodine. When she sat back down, he was watching her. The grey eyes were sharp now, tracking her every movement. "No cops," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. "My phone is dead," Nora said, uncapping the iodine. "And the storm knocked out the landlines on this block 3 hours ago. You're out of luck. You only get me." She peeled his hand back. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with iodine. He hissed through his teeth but didn't flinch, and packing it with sterile gauze. She taped it down tight, wrapping a length of bandage entirely around his torso to keep it secure. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping a streak of blood off her forehead with the back of her wrist. The man was watching her hands. "You have training," he noted, his breathing slightly easier now that the wound was bound. "A semester and a half of nursing school before the money ran out," Nora replied. She picked up the bottle of whiskey, took a swig straight from the neck, and offered it to him. He looked at the bottle, then at her. He took it, his hand shaking slightly, and took a long pull. He handed it back. "Roman." "Roman," Nora repeated. She looked at his ruined clothes, the gun resting on the floorboard a few feet away. "Who shot you, Roman?" "People who are currently looking for me," he said simply. Nora sighed. She grabbed a throw blanket from the sofa and tossed it over him. Great. Well, they aren't finding you tonight. The roads are closed. It's a whiteout. Roman shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his side. He looked around the cramped, faded apartment. The water stains on the ceiling, the duct tape on the window frame. Why did you bring me in? Nora stood up, gathering the bloody towels. It's -10 degrees out there. I wouldn't leave a stray dog to freeze. She walked into the kitchen, dumping the towels in the sink. When she came back, Roman was asleep again, or unconscious. The line was blurry. Nora didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair opposite him, the gun resting on the coffee table between them. She watched his chest rise and fall. She listened to the wind battering the glass. She knew who these kinds of men were. She knew the violence that clung to them like cheap cologne. She'd spent her whole life keeping her head down, avoiding the shadows, paying her rent, surviving. Tonight, she had invited the shadows in. She pulled her knees to her chest, pulling her sweater tighter against the chill, and waited for the dawn. The cold woke her. The radiator had finally given up entirely. Nora blinked her eyes open, her neck stiff from sleeping in the armchair. The apartment was bathed in the harsh, blinding light of a winter morning. The storm had broken. Outside, the world was silent, buried under 2 feet of snow. She looked at the floor. The rug was stained a dark, rusty brown. Roman was sitting up. He was propped against the base of the sofa, his long legs stretched out. He had put his silk shirt back on, though it was stiff with dried blood, and he was currently checking the magazine of his handgun. He moved with a stiff, guarded precision, favoring his left side. He looked up as she stirred. Morning. His voice was stronger today. The grey eyes were alert, completely devoid of the vulnerability from the night before. You're alive, Nora noted, her voice rough with sleep. She stood up, her joints popping in the cold air. Thanks to you, Roman said. He slid the magazine back into the grip with a sharp clack. He set the gun down and reached into the inner pocket of his ruined overcoat. He pulled out a sleek, heavy-looking satellite phone. Nora paused on her way to the kitchen. I told you the lines were down. This doesn't use local lines, Roman said. He pressed a single button and held it to his ear. Nora watched him. The transformation was complete. Gone was the bleeding stray. Sitting on her stained rug was a man who commanded gravity. He didn't speak immediately. He just waited. Then, into the receiver, he said 2 words. I'm here. He hung up. He looked at Nora. Do you have coffee? Nora stared at him for a second, then scoffed, walking into the kitchen. Instant. And the water takes 10 minutes to boil on this stove. Instant is fine. She filled the kettle and struck a match to light the temperamental gas burner. While the water heated, she leaned against the counter, looking out the small window that faced the street. The plows hadn't come through yet. The street was an untouched sea of white. Who did you call? Nora asked, raising her voice to be heard over the hiss of the gas. My people, Roman replied from the living room. Are they bringing an ambulance? A low chuckle drifted from the other room. It sounded entirely devoid of humor. No, they aren't bringing an ambulance. Nora poured the boiling water over the bitter, instant granules. She carried 2 chipped mugs into the living room, handing one down to him. She didn't sit in the armchair. She stood by the window, sipping the scalding, terrible coffee. You shouldn't be moving, she said, looking down at him. You need stitches, real ones, and antibiotics. I'll get them, Roman said, taking a sip of the coffee. He didn't even grimace at the taste. I need to leave before I bring my problems to your door. I think you already did, Nora muttered. They drank in silence for another 10 minutes. The tension in the room was a living thing. Roman kept glancing at his watch, a heavy silver piece that probably cost more than her building. Then, Nora felt it. Before she heard anything, she felt a vibration in the floorboards. It started as a low hum, shivering up through the soles of her boots. It was deep, rhythmic. She walked to the window, wiping the condensation off the glass with the sleeve of her sweater. She looked down at the street. The mug slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor, shattering, hot coffee splattering across her boots. Roman didn't flinch. "They're here." Nora couldn't speak. She stared out the window, her breath catching in her throat. Turning the corner onto Elm Street wasn't a car. It wasn't an ambulance. It was a fleet. A massive, armoured snowplow led the convoy, violently shoving the 2 feet of snow aside, throwing waves of white powder over the buried parked cars. Behind the plow came the SUVs. They were all identical. Massive, custom-built black machines with tinted windows and reinforced steel bumpers. One turned the corner, then another, then 5, then 10. They kept coming. They filled the street, a relentless creeping tide of matte black metal rolling slowly over the freshly ploughed asphalt. They were blocking intersections, sealing off the block from both ends. Men in dark winter coats were stepping out of the vehicles before they even came to a complete stop, their hands resting inside their jackets. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. The entire street, her entire world, was suddenly occupied by a private army. Nora slowly turned away from the window. She looked at Roman. He was using the edge of the sofa to pull himself up, gritting his teeth as he straightened his posture. "Who are you?" Nora whispered. Roman looked at her, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't answer the question. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy money clip, tossing it onto the coffee table. It hit the wood with a solid thud. "For the rug," Roman said, his voice flat. And the coffee. The front door of the apartment building downstairs flew open with a resounding crash. Heavy boots began thundering up the stairwell, not just a few, an overwhelming number. Nora backed up against the wall. She realized then, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that she hadn't saved a stray dog from the cold. She had brought the wolf inside. The deadbolt didn't even slow them down. There was a singular deafening crack, and the door frame splintered inward. Wood fragments rained across the cheap linoleum of the entryway. Nora flinched, pressing her spine so hard against the living room wall she felt the cold plaster bite through her sweater. 5 men breached the apartment in terrifying unison. They didn't yell. They didn't announce themselves as police. They moved with a silent, practiced lethality, sweeping the tiny kitchen, the bathroom, and the living room in a matter of seconds. They were dressed in tailored dark suits beneath heavy winter coats, but there was nothing corporate about them. They held suppressed automatic weapons tight against their shoulders, their eyes scanning for targets. One of them, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his right eyebrow, locked his sights on Nora. The muzzle of his weapon pointed squarely at her chest. "Clear!" another man barked from the bathroom. "Stand down!" Roman said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whip. The men froze. The man aiming at Nora lowered his weapon by a fraction of an inch, though his eyes never left her face. A 6th man stepped through the ruined doorway. He was older than the rest, his greying hair swept back, his topcoat dusted with snow. He took one look at Roman, sitting propped against the sofa with a bloody bandage wrapped around his torso and the colour drained from his face. "Boss!" the older man said, his voice tight. He holstered a sidearm and rushed forward, dropping to one knee beside the sofa. "We scoured the entire riverfront. When the tracker went dark, we assumed the worst. The Moretti crew is tearing the south side apart looking for you." "They missed," Roman said flatly. He grabbed the older man's shoulder, using him for leverage to finally stand. Roman swayed for a fraction of a second. 2 of the armed men instantly stepped forward, but Roman raised a hand, stopping them dead in their tracks. He didn't want help. He stood tall, his posture rigid, masking the agony that had to be tearing through his left side. "Get the medic in the primary vehicle," the older man ordered over his shoulder. "We need him prepped for surgery the second we hit the tower. Arthur, clear a path." "Wait," Roman said. The room went entirely still again. Roman turned his head. His pale grey eyes found Nora, still pinned against the wall. The older man followed his gaze. He looked at the bloody shears on the coffee table, the ruined, blood-soaked dish towels in the kitchen sink, the bottle of whiskey. Then he looked at Nora. It was an entirely clinical evaluation. He was doing the math on her life. "Who is this?" the older man asked. "She pulled me off the porch," Roman said. The older man frowned. "She saw your face. She knows you're alive. The Morettis have guys knocking on doors 3 blocks from here. If they find her, they'll break her to get your location." He didn't say it with malice. He said it like a weather forecast. "We can't leave a loose end, Roman." Nora's stomach plummeted. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The man with the scar raised his weapon slightly, waiting for the nod. "I didn't see anything," Nora lied. Her voice shook just once, before she forced it steady. "I don't know who you are. You leave, I go to work. This never happened." The older man looked at her with genuine pity. "It doesn't work like that, sweetheart." Roman buttoned his ruined overcoat, concealing the bloody bandage. "Pack her up, Elias." Nora pushed off the wall. "What? No, absolutely not." Elias, the older man, signaled 2 of the guards. They stepped toward her, their expressions blank. "Don't touch me," Nora snapped, backing up until her hips hit the radiator. She looked at Roman, anger burning through her terror. "I saved your life. You owe me." "I paid you for the rug," Roman said. His face was a mask of carved stone. "And this is me paying you for my life. The people looking for me are butchers. If I leave you here, they will find the blood on your porch. They will take you to a basement. They will peel your skin off to find out which way I went, and then they will kill you. Get your coat, Nora." "You're kidnapping me." "I am preserving my investment," Roman corrected smoothly. "You kept me breathing. I prefer my saviors alive. Elias, if she resists, carry her." The 2 men stepped closer. Nora looked at their broad shoulders, the guns strapped to their chests, and the sheer number of vehicles idling outside her window. There was no fire escape that wasn't frozen shut. There was no police force in this city that could push through 500 private soldiers in time to save her. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She walked over to the armchair, grabbed her cheap, heavy winter coat, and shoved her arms into the sleeves. "I'm walking," she said, her voice laced with venom. Roman gave a single, curt nod. Smart girl. They funneled out of the apartment. Nora was placed in the center of the formation. As she stepped out of the building and into the blinding white snow, the sheer scale of the operation hit her. Elm Street was a fortress. Men were stationed on rooftops, on street corners, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Elias opened the heavy armored door of the lead SUV. Nora climbed in. The interior smelled of expensive leather and gunpowder. Roman slid in next to her, moving slowly, his jaw locked tight. A man holding a trauma kit immediately climbed into the 3rd row, leaning over the seat to cut away the bandage Nora had applied just hours ago. The doors slammed shut. The sound was heavy, final, like a vault locking. "Move out!" Elias ordered from the front passenger seat. The convoy surged forward, tires chewing through the deep snow. Nora looked out the tinted window. She watched her crumbling apartment building shrink in the distance, swallowed by the falling snow and the imposing black metal of the vehicles trailing them. She had spent 5 years in that apartment, trying to remain invisible. In a single night, the shadows had found her anyway. The drive was a blur of silence and tension. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the back of Elias's headrest, refusing to look at Roman. Beside her, the medic worked in frantic silence, cleaning the gunshot wound with professional chemicals that stung the air, injecting something into Roman's neck, and applying a military-grade coagulant patch. Roman didn't make a sound. He just stared out the window at the passing city. They didn't go to the hospital. They bypassed the commercial districts entirely, the convoy weaving through the snow-choked streets until they reached the financial district. They pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a massive, soaring skyscraper of dark glass and steel. The garage was completely empty, save for a dozen armed guards waiting near a private, stainless steel elevator bank. "Clear the floor," Elias commanded into a radio as the SUV rolled to a stop. Roman was ushered out first. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the blood loss was catching up to him. He was pale, leaning heavily on one of the guards, but he refused a stretcher. Nora was nudged out of the vehicle by Elias. "Stay close." They packed into the oversized elevator. The digital display climbed rapidly, your ears popping as they bypassed 50, 60, 70 floors. It stopped on the penthouse level. The doors slid open, and Nora blinked against the sudden flood of warm ambient light. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress disguised as an architectural digest cover. The floors were polished black marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the frozen city below. Expensive modern art hung on dark wood-paneled walls. It was pristine, silent, and cold. A team of people in medical scrubs was waiting. They immediately converged on Roman, transferring him to a gurney despite his low, irritated protests, and wheeled him down a long hallway toward a set of double doors. Nora stood alone in the massive foyer, her cheap, snow-damp boots leaving a small puddle on the immaculate marble. Elias approached her. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline fading to leave deep bags under his eyes. "Follow me, please." He didn't wait for an answer. He led her down a separate hallway, past a massive open-concept kitchen and a library lined with thousands of books. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door and opened it. "This is the guest suite," Elias said. "There are fresh clothes in the closet. The bathroom is fully stocked. If you need anything to eat or drink, pick up the phone on the nightstand. It connects to the kitchen." Nora looked into the room. It was larger than her entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed, a sitting area with a velvet sofa, and a wall of glass looking out over the blizzard. "How long am I staying here?" Nora asked. Elias looked at her. He didn't offer a polite lie. "Until the boss says otherwise." "I have a shift at the diner tomorrow at 6 a.m., she said, clinging to the mundane reality of her life in a desperate attempt to ground herself. "If I don't show up, I lose my job. If I lose my job, I don't make rent." Elias pulled a thick, banded stack of $100 bills from his jacket pocket. He set it on a small console table just inside the door. "You just made rent for the next 5 years. Get some sleep, Nora." He stepped back and closed the door. Nora listened. She heard the distinct, heavy click of a deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. She walked over to the door and tried the handle. It didn't budge. She was locked in. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the shock. She turned around, surveying the luxurious room. She walked to the window. The glass was thick, completely soundproof, and likely bulletproof. There was no balcony. She was 80 stories in the air. She walked into the bathroom. It was a cathedral of white marble, featuring a massive soaking tub and a walk-in shower. There was a plush white robe hanging on the door. She caught her reflection in the sprawling mirror above the double vanity. She looked like a ghost. Her dark hair was tangled, her eyes wide and bruised with exhaustion. There was a smear of Roman's blood dried on her jawline. Her sweater was ruined, stained with iodine and rust-colored patches. She turned on the shower, cranking the handle until the water was scalding hot. She stripped off her clothes, leaving them in a pile on the marble floor, and stepped under the spray. She scrubbed at the blood on her skin until it turned red and raw. The reality of the situation washed over her with the hot water. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a savior. She was a hostage. Kept alive because a crime lord decided she was a liability to leave behind. When she stepped out, she dried off and put on the oversized white robe. She walked into the bedroom. She didn't touch the money on the table. She didn't pick up the phone to order food. She lay down on top of the immaculate duvet, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared at the locked oak door. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who believed someone was coming to save them. Nora just closed her eyes and began to calculate her odds. She lost track of time. In the penthouse, the temperature was perfectly regulated and the ambient lighting shifted automatically, making it impossible to tell day from night. A woman in a neat uniform unlocked the door twice to bring in trays of food. Steak, roasted vegetables, fresh fruit, coffee. Nora ate because starving herself was a terrible survival strategy, but she didn't speak to the woman, who kept her eyes averted and left as quickly as she came. It was on the second day, roughly 48 hours since the shootout on her porch, that the lock clicked and Elias walked in. "He wants to see you," Elias said. Nora stood up. She had found a pair of black sweatpants and a grey cashmere sweater in the closet that fit her well enough. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Does he usually summon his prisoners, or is this a special occasion?" Elias didn't smile. "Walk." He escorted her down the hallway. The penthouse was quiet, but it wasn't empty. She saw men stationed at the exits, all wearing earpieces, their eyes scanning the corridors. Elias opened a set of double doors at the end of the hall, gesturing for her to enter. It was an office, heavily panelled in dark mahogany. The back wall was a wall of monitors displaying dozens of security feeds from around the city. Roman was seated behind a massive desk. He looked better, though still pale. He was wearing a dark button-down shirt, the collar open. An IV line ran from his left arm to a bag of clear fluid, hanging on a metal stand beside his chair. He was reading a file, a tablet resting on the desk in front of him. He looked up as she entered. He gestured to a leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit." "I prefer to stand," Nora said. Roman studied her for a moment. He closed the file. "Elias tells me you haven't touched the money." "I don't want your money," Nora said, her voice hard. "I want to go home. You got your stitches. You're safe in your tower. Let me go." Roman steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the desk. "You think I brought you here to punish you? You locked me in a room for 2 days. What do you call it?" "Quarantine," Roman replied smoothly. He reached out and tapped the screen of the tablet, sliding it across the polished wood of the desk toward her. "Look at it." Nora frowned, stepping forward hesitantly. She looked down at the screen. It was a drone feed, displaying a high-definition aerial view of a city block. It took her a second to recognize the snow-covered rooftops, the familiar intersection of Elm Street. Then she saw her building. The roof was partially caved in. The windows on the 3rd floor were blown out, black scorch marks licking up the brick facade. Fire trucks were parked in the street below, spraying water onto the smouldering remains of the structure. Nora's breath hitched. She placed both hands on the edge of the desk, leaning in to stare at the screen. Her apartment, her life, reduced to a blackened, smoking crater. "They hid it yesterday afternoon," Roman said, his voice devoid of emotion. 3 men. They kicked your door in, found the blood on the rug, and assumed you were hiding me. When they couldn't find a false floor or a basement, they tossed an incendiary grenade into your kitchen to burn the evidence. Nora couldn't speak. Her chest tightened, a cold vice clamping down on her lungs. If she had stayed, if he had left her there, she would have been inside. "I didn't kidnap you, Nora," Roman said softly, watching the horror register in her eyes. "I postponed your funeral." She looked up at him. The cynical defensive armor she wore had cracked. "Who are they?" "The Moretti family," Roman said, leaning back in his chair. "A rival syndicate. They want the port routes I control. They decided the easiest way to negotiate was to put a bullet in my ribs." "So what now?" Nora asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "My home is gone. Everything I own was in that apartment." "You are under my protection now," Roman stated. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact. "The Morettis know you exist. They know someone pulled me off the street. They will check the hospital records, the morgues, the police chatter. When they don't find a body in that fire, they will start hunting you to get to me." Nora ran a hand through her hair, pacing a few steps away from the desk before turning back. "This is insane. I am a waitress. I have $32 in my checking account. I am not part of a mob war." "You became part of it the second you opened your front door," Roman countered, his tone hardening. "You made a choice, Nora. You dragged a bleeding man into your home. You applied pressure. You stopped the bleeding. You entered the game. Because I am a decent human being, she yelled, her anger finally boiling over. Because I don't let people die in the snow. And that decency is exactly what they will weaponize against you, Roman said, his grey eyes flashing with an intensity that made her step back. In my world, empathy is a vulnerability. You showed me mercy, and now it has a price tag on it. I am paying that price by keeping you alive. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the faint hum of the servers running the security monitors. Nora looked at the man sitting behind the desk. He was a monster. A wealthy, cultured, entirely ruthless monster. But he was also right. The smoking ruin of her apartment was proof of that. How long? She finally asked, her voice hollow. Roman looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. He saw the fight drain out of her, replaced by a cold, practical calculation. He respected that. Panic was useless. Pragmatism kept you breathing. Until I kill the men who gave the order, Roman said simply. Until the Moretti family is entirely eradicated. Nora let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, just a casual genocide then. The corner of Roman's mouth twitched upward. It was a microscopic movement, but it transformed his face, making him look surprisingly human. I am thorough. And what am I supposed to do while you're out slaughtering your rivals? Nora asked, crossing her arms again. Sit in that velvet box and wait. You are going to do exactly what I tell you to do, Roman said, the amusement vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He unhooked the IV from his arm with a practiced motion, pressing a piece of gauze to the puncture wound. He stood up, walking slowly around the desk until he was standing only a few feet from her. He was incredibly tall up close, towering over her. The scent of him, expensive soap, iron, and something darkly masculine, invaded her space. You don't leave this floor. You don't make outgoing calls. You don't speak to the staff about anything other than your immediate needs, Roman instructed, looking down at her. The people hunting me have eyes everywhere. If you compromise this location, you compromise us both. Nora held his gaze. She was terrified, but she refused to look away. I'm a hostage. You are an asset, Roman corrected, his voice dropping an octave. And I protect my assets. He reached out. Nora flinched, but he only raised his hand to brush a stray lock of dark hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers were warm, the brief contact sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Survive this with me, Nora, Roman murmured, his thumb briefly grazing her jawline. And I will give you a life you never have to run from. He dropped his hand and turned away, walking back toward his desk. Elias will take you back to your room. Dinner is at 8. You will join me in the dining room. Nora stood frozen for a second, her skin still burning where he had touched her. She turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She was trapped in a glass cage with a predator. And the most terrifying part wasn't the men trying to kill him. The terrifying part was that, for a split second when he touched her, she hadn't wanted to pull away. Dinner at 8 was an exercise in psychological warfare. Nora walked into the dining room at precisely 1 minute to the hour. The room was cavernous, dominated by a long, polished walnut table that could comfortably seat 20. Roman was already there, sitting at the head of the table. He was dressed in a dark, tailored suit, though he had left the jacket off, the shoulder holster stark against his crisp white shirt. He didn't look up from the tablet in his hand as she took a seat at his right. A chef materialized from a side door, serving plates of seared scallops and saffron risotto in total silence. The wine poured into Nora's glass was deep red and smelled of oak and earth. It probably cost more than her community college tuition. Nora picked up her fork. The silver was heavy, perfectly balanced. She looked at the man beside her. Do you ever stop working? Roman set the tablet face down on the table. He picked up his wine glass, taking a slow sip. If I stop working, people die. Usually my people, sometimes me. Must be exhausting, Nora said, slicing into a scallop. It melted on her tongue. The sheer quality of the food made her angry. It was a reminder of the chasm between them. "It is a necessary burden," Roman replied smoothly. He watched her eat. He wasn't touching his own food. "You adapted quickly. No tears. No begging to be let go." "Tears don't put out fires," Nora said, keeping her eyes on her plate. "And begging only works on people who have a conscience. I figured out a long time ago that rich men don't get rich by feeling sorry for the collateral damage." Roman laughed softly. The sound echoed in the massive room. "You think I'm just a rich man?" Nora finally looked at him. The grey eyes were sharp, catching the ambient light of the chandelier overhead. "I think you're a criminal who bought a really nice suit to hide the fact that he's a butcher." The silence that followed was heavy. Nora waited for the anger, for the veiled threat. She had pushed too far. Instead, Roman reached over and poured himself a glass of water. "I grew up in the Narrows," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual polished command. Nora blinked. The Narrows was a slum on the east side, a place so hollowed out by poverty and drugs that even the cops wouldn't patrol it after dark. It was worse than Elm Street. It was a black hole. "My father ran numbers for the old regime," Roman continued, staring at his glass. He was a small, frightened man who thought loyalty to sociopaths would buy his safety. "They beat him to death with a tire iron in an alley when I was 12 because he was short on his weekly collection by $200. My mother died of a heroin overdose 6 months later. The needle was still in her arm when I found her." He looked at Nora. There was no pity in his eyes, just cold, hard fact. "I am not a butcher because I enjoy the blood, Nora. I am a butcher because the world I was born into only understands violence. I built this empire so that no one could ever put a tire iron to my head again. I wear the suit so they look at me and see power, not the terrified kid from the Narrows. So yes, I am a criminal, but I am a criminal who controls the chaos." The Morettis, they are animals. They burn down apartment buildings just to send a message. Nora stared at him. The cynicism she wielded like a shield felt suddenly fragile. She looked down at her hands, resting on the edge of the walnut table. "I still lost everything. You lost a rotting apartment and a job that paid you pennies to destroy your feet," Roman said brutally. "You survived. That is the only metric that matters." "Easy for you to say from the top of the world." Roman leaned closer. The scent of him, iron, clean soap, and something dangerous, washed over her. "The top of the world is just a longer fall. I know exactly what I am, Nora. The question is, what are you?" He stood up, abandoning his untouched dinner. "Finish your food. Tomorrow, Elias will bring you a phone. It will only dial 3 numbers. Elias, the front desk, and me. Keep it charged." He walked out of the room, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. Nora sat alone in the massive dining room, the expensive wine suddenly tasting like ash in her mouth. She had wanted to hate him entirely. It would have been easier to hate a monster. But the man who just walked away wasn't a monster. He was a survivor, just like her. Routine is a powerful anesthetic. For the next 10 days, Nora existed in a strange, suspended reality. She woke. She drank coffee on the velvet sofa. She read books from Roman's massive library. She saw him rarely. He was a ghost in his own home, constantly moving between meetings in the lower floors, conducting a silent, brutal war against the Moretti family from behind heavily encrypted screens. Elias was her shadow. He brought her meals. He brought her the promised phone. And he watched her with a quiet, paternal intensity. She learned the rhythms of the penthouse, the guard change at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., the cleaning staff that came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, heavily vetted and escorted by armed security. It was a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a bruised, heavy grey, threatening more snow. Nora was in the library, curled into a leather armchair with a battered copy of Crime and Punishment. The penthouse was quiet. Roman was on the 65th floor, securing a logistics deal. Elias was with him. Only a skeleton crew remained on the penthouse level. The door to the library clicked open. Nora didn't look up immediately. The cleaning staff usually worked around her in silence. But the footsteps were wrong. They were too heavy, too deliberate for the quiet, efficient women who polished the floors. Nora lowered the book. A man in a grey maintenance uniform stood in the doorway. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand. The barrel was aimed squarely at Nora's chest. He didn't look like a killer. He looked ordinary. He had a slight overbite, thinning brown hair, and a nervous sweat gathering on his upper lip. But the gun in his hand didn't shake. "Don't scream," the man said. His voice was a reedy whisper. "The guards in the hall are dead. You scream. I put a bullet in your stomach, and you bleed out on the carpet." Nora's blood turned to ice water. The air in the room vanished. She slowly set the book down on the side table. Her mind raced, violently pulling her back to the survival instincts she'd honed on the streets. Assess the threat. Find the exit. Find the weapon. There was no exit. The man blocked the only door. There were no weapons, just books and a heavy brass lamp on the desk 10 feet away. "Stand up," the man ordered. Nora stood slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Who are you?" "I'm the guy buying his family a ticket out of the country," the man said. He gestured with the gun towards the door. "Moretti wants you. He figured out Roman's keeping a pet up here. Says if I bring you down to the freight elevator, he wires $1 million to an offshore account." "He's lying," Nora said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It wasn't bravery. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "Moretti kills loose ends. You walk me out of here. He shoots us both and keeps his money." The man swallowed hard. "Move!" Nora took a step forward. The man stepped back into the giving her room to exit the library. She stepped out. The hallway was a slaughterhouse. 2 of Roman's elite guards lay crumpled on the marble floor. One had a bullet hole clean through his temple. The other was bleeding profusely from his neck. The metallic smell of blood hit her, identical to the smell on her porch 2 weeks ago. Nora stopped. The phone Roman gave her was in the pocket of her sweatpants. She needed 3 seconds to dial. The man with the gun would pull the trigger in 1. "Keep moving! To the elevators!" the man hissed, stepping up behind her and pressing the muzzle of the suppressor hard into the base of her spine. Nora started walking. Her mind clicked into a hyper-focused clarity. If she got in that elevator, she was dead. She was leverage. And once Moretti used her to draw Roman out, she would be disposed of in an industrial incinerator. She wasn't dying today. Not for a coward with a stolen uniform. They passed the open kitchen. The massive granite island was pristine. A heavy crystal vase filled with white orchids sat near the edge. "Stop stalling!" the man growled, shoving the gun harder against her spine. "I'm going," Nora said. She took one more step. Then she dropped. Nora collapsed her knees entirely, dropping her center of gravity like a stone. The gun slipped off her back, the man stumbling forward slightly at the sudden loss of resistance. In a fraction of a second, Nora twisted on the floor, kicking upward with her heavy boot. She caught the man squarely in the kneecap. There was a sickening pop, and the man screamed, his leg buckling inward. The gun fired. The suppressed shot sounded like a violent cough. The bullet shattered the granite edge of the kitchen island, sending razor-sharp stone shrapnel spraying into the air. Nora scrambled backward, her hands sliding on the polished marble. The man fell to one knee, swearing violently, leveling the gun at her again. Nora grabbed the first thing her hand found, a heavy, solid steel bar stool. She hurled it at him. The stool crashed into the man's shoulder, knocking his aim wide. His second shot blew a hole through a massive pane of glass in the living room, the concussive force rattling the entire floor. The man was recovering, raising the gun. He was furious now. The nervous sweat was gone, replaced by lethal intent. Nora scrambled up, throwing herself behind the kitchen island. "I'm going to kill you, you stupid bitch!" the man screamed, limping toward her cover. Nora crawled furiously along the floor behind the island. She reached the end of the counter. She needed a weapon. Her hand brushed against a heavy wooden block. The knife block. She pulled an 8-inch chef's knife free. The steel gleamed in the ambient light. She gripped the heavy handle with both hands, pressing her back against the cabinet, breathing hard. Footsteps, heavy, dragging, limping footsteps. He was coming around the corner of the island. "I can see your shadow," the man laughed, a desperate, ugly sound. Nora didn't wait for him to turn the corner. She exploded out from behind cover. The man raised the gun, his eyes widening. Nora didn't hesitate. She drove the blade forward with every ounce of strength in her body, burying it to the hilt in the man's thigh, right below the femoral artery. He shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman sound, dropping the gun. He fell backward, his hands desperately clutching at the handle of the knife sticking out of his leg. Blood immediately soaked through the grey uniform. Nora kicked the gun away across the marble floor. She stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands covered in his blood. She stared down at the man writhing on the floor of the immaculate kitchen. She wasn't scared anymore. She was vibrating with a primal, terrifying rage. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the penthouse burst open. Roman stormed in. He had a weapon drawn, moving with terrifying speed, Elias right behind him. They stopped dead in their tracks at the entrance to the kitchen. They saw the dead guards in the hall. They saw the shattered glass. And they saw Nora, standing over a bleeding assassin, entirely unharmed. Roman lowered his weapon slowly. His eyes locked onto Nora. She looked up at him. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She wiped a streak of blood off her cheek with the back of her hand. "You need better security," Nora said, her voice completely deadpan. Roman didn't flinch. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. He stepped over the bleeding man on the floor as if he were a discarded piece of furniture. He stopped directly in front of Nora. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders. His grip was tight, almost painful. He searched her face, looking for the fracture, the breakdown. He found nothing but steel. "Are you hurt?" Roman asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "No," Nora said. Roman looked down at the man on the floor. The assassin was groaning, clutching the knife in his leg, his face pale with blood loss. "Elias," Roman said softly. Elias stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute fury. He grabbed the wounded man by the collar of his uniform, dragging him backward across the marble floor, leaving a thick smeared trail of red. The man screamed as the knife jostled, but Elias didn't stop until he reached the freight elevator doors. Roman turned back to Nora. He let go of her shoulders, pulling a clean white handkerchief from his pocket. He took her hands, gently wiping the blood off her fingers. His touch was incredibly precise, almost tender, a stark contrast to the violence surrounding them. "He was a cleaner," Roman said quietly, cleaning her palm. "Passed a 6-month background check. Moretti must have found a gambling debt. Leveraged him." "He said Moretti wanted me alive," Nora said, watching his hands. "As bait." Roman stopped wiping. He looked up, his pale grey eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "Moretti made a fatal miscalculation. He thought you were a weakness. He thought you were a civilian." "I am a civilian, Roman." "No," Roman said, stepping closer. "You aren't, not anymore. Civilians freeze when a gun is pointed at them. Civilians beg. You put a knife through a man's leg and kicked his weapon away. You belong in the dark, Nora. You just never had the capital to thrive in it." Nora stared at him. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had hated the violence. She had hated the fear, but in the moment of truth, she hadn't folded. She had fought. The gritty, cynical survivor inside her had taken the wheel, and she had won. "I'm going to end this tonight," Roman said, stepping back. He tossed the bloody handkerchief onto the counter. "The Moretti family is eradicated before dawn. I will burn their compound to the ground, and I will cut Carmine Moretti's throat myself." He turned to leave. "Roman." He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Nora stood tall in the ruined kitchen. "Make sure it hurts." A slow, genuinely terrifying smile spread across Roman's face. It was the smile of a predator, recognizing its mate. "It will be biblical." He walked out. Nora didn't sleep that night. She sat in the library, looking out the massive window at the city skyline. Below her, the streets were dark, silent, completely unaware of the war raging in the shadows. At 4:00 a.m., her phone buzzed. She picked it up. One word was glowing on the screen. A text from Roman. Done. Nora exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 weeks. She set the phone down. The war was over. The debt was paid. The next morning, Roman returned to the penthouse. He smelled of smoke and gunpowder. He walked into the library, looking exhausted but victorious. He sat heavily in the armchair opposite her, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass from a crystal decanter. He didn't speak immediately. He just drank the whiskey, the silence stretching comfortably between them. "You're free," Roman finally said, setting the empty glass down. "The threat is eliminated. The accounts have been settled. Elias bought a townhouse in the West End under a shell corporation. It's fully furnished. The deed is in your name. There is $10 million in a secure offshore account waiting for you. You can walk out of that door and you will never see me again." Nora looked at him. She looked at the expensive suit, the dark shadows under his eyes, the brutal, beautiful world he had dragged her into. She thought about the crumbling apartment on Elm Street. She thought about the diner. She thought about being invisible. She realized she didn't want to be invisible anymore. Nora stood up. She walked over to the decanter, pouring herself a glass of whiskey. She took a slow sip, the amber liquid burning beautifully on the way down. She walked over to his chair, looking down at the most dangerous man in the city. "I don't want a townhouse in the West End," Nora said, her voice low and steady. Roman looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then what do you want, Nora?" Nora set the glass down on the side table. She reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of his jacket, tracing the line of his jaw. She felt the tension in his muscles, the coiled violence resting just beneath the surface. "I want to stay," Nora said. Roman went completely still. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist, pulling her down so her face was inches from his. The air between them crackled, charged with electricity and unspoken promises. "If you stay," Roman whispered, his voice rough, "there is no walking away. You are mine. You are my partner, my equal, and my liability. I will build an empire around you, but you will live in the shadows with me forever. You understand what that means?" Nora didn't pull away. She leaned closer, her lips brushing against his ear. "I brought the wolf inside," Nora whispered back, her cynical, hardened heart finally finding its match. "I'm not letting him out." Roman pulled her down, his mouth crashing into hers, bruising and desperate, sealing the pact in blood and fire. The freezing mob boss had finally found a shelter he never wanted to leave. What happens when the girl who hides from the world decides to rule the shadows instead? Nora didn't just survive the freeze, she became the ice. If you loved this gritty journey of survival, loyalty, and a romance forged in a literal crossfire, you know what to do. Hit that like button right now to show your support and share this with anyone who loves a mafia story where the heroine doesn't just need saving, she does the saving. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next epic audio drama. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment.